Welcome to the latest Fun Skills Monthly Update, Webinar 11. We're actually coming to the end of our original run of monthly Functional Skills Update webinars, having started them last August, although the good news is they will be continuing as a regular monthly fixture into the autumn and beyond. The focus will of course change slightly once the reformed functional skills qualifications have gone live in September, but this regular session will allow us to address any hot topics as and when they crop up, as well as delving into the broader maths and English arena. Do also bear in mind that the complete box set of recordings and slides from the previous 10 sessions are available from our Functional Skills Updates page.
So, a slight change plan from our usual this month. A slight change of plan from usual this month as we've pre-recorded this actual webinar. Paul and I are out and about this afternoon, although we were able to grab a bit of time earlier today to record this for you. You've got two out of three of us today, as it's a rarity for all of us to actually be in the same building, let alone to be in the same room. And hopefully you've had a chance to book and or attend one of our Fun Skills launch events. There are still more dates to come, and we're now going to be staying on the road throughout August, so do look out for extra dates and places we're adding to the events calendar.
One consequence of us not being live is we can't answer any of your questions right now, but do still feel free to ask them, as we will be able to pick them up later. The main focus of this month's session is a more detailed look at English, the subject content statements and how they follow it through into assessment outcomes. We're only going to be looking at level 1 and level 2 for now, although we'll no doubt have a similar look at entry level in due course.
Okay, if you're new to these webinars, and we still have more places registering each month, more people registering this month. I think I've been on the road too much, Paul. I think that's what's up with me, yeah. And I really need a holiday. So start again. So if you're new to these actual webinars and we still have more people registering each month, please be aware that you can find much more information about the Fun Skills 2019 reforms on our dedicated updates page. The link on this slide will take you straight there. Remember, we always send these slides out a day or so after each webinar, or you can watch the recording at your leisure. Also, if you haven't already done so, please sign up for our email updates. The arrow on this slide is pointing out the link that appears at the bottom of every City & Guilds webpage where you can sign up.
So what's new this month? Well, firstly, we're still, as we said, adding more launch events. We continue to be overwhelmed in a good way by the level of interest and engagement these have had. And we now have dates on the calendar running right throughout August. Thanks must especially go to the various colleges and training organisations that have kindly offered to host some of these events, and to all of you who've attended these sessions. After the big fanfare last month about our level 1, level 2 qualifications formally completing the technical evaluation process, we can report that our proposals for entry level are currently back with Ofqual for a final formal review. As we've explained before, the process has a number of formal stages, but in practice, all of those have been happening alongside a pattern of near constant dialogue between our assessment team and their counterparts at Ofqual. So we are optimistic, or at least as optimistic as we can be, that these really aren't far away from getting the official green light.
So for some more of the eagle-eyed amongst you, you might have spotted that our new 4748 webpage has now gone live, at least as an outline. For various practical reasons, we haven't yet moved any of the new spec documents or sample assessments across to the new page. So for the time being, they can still be found on the 3748 page under additional documents. It's also worth mentioning that the handbook spec documents are also now on the website. They do still, for now, have a draft watermark through them, including level 1 to 2, even though they are completed, that these have actually completed the formal technical evaluation, as we're still making a few changes to some aspects of the supporting guidance. Nevertheless, the subject content statements and other core aspects of the specifications certainly won't be changing at this stage.
So, who remembers this document? I still have an extremely dog-eared copy of it in my office at home, and there's a PDF version of it available for most of our maths and English qualification web pages. Much as we've talked during these sessions about the level expectations for the reformed functional skills diverging in some respects from the adult literacy standards, This document is still an extremely valuable resource nearly 2 decades on from when it was originally produced. Our functional skills examiners still regularly reach for it when they're making finely balanced judgments about whether to award a mark. So please don't think that just because there's new functional skills subject content and some of the level expectations have changed, that the core curriculum is no longer useful or relevant. If you take away one message from this session, it's please don't bin your copy of the curriculum just yet. The other reason for us mentioning this now is that one of the things we're planning to include in the next iteration of our mapping grids is the relevant core curriculum references to help illustrate some of the things that might appear to be new about the reformed functional skills but aren't necessarily really that new.
There has been talk at the events that some people said the price of these will go up on eBay, Paul. So.
What, the curriculums? Yeah, you can still get them.
Yeah, I've still got my copies and very valuable they are too. So now diving into English reading, as we mentioned earlier, we're only looking at levels for levels 1 and 2 for now, but will no doubt be returning to entry level in another webinar. Both level 1 and level 2 will require candidates to read 2 source documents, answer questions on each document, and be able to make comparisons across the documents. The requirement to compare across documents is new to level 1, although those of us with long enough memories might recall it being there for key skills. We've tended to have more than 2 documents in our current reading assessments, so having just 2 documents is a consistent pattern, is another change to bear in mind, along with the new time allowance of 1 hour.
As we've mentioned before, the reformed functional skills qualifications are underpinned by the subject content document published last year by the DFE. The specifications at each level comprise a number of what are described as subject content statements, as you'll see on the following pages. This is the spec for reading at level 1. Quite a busy slide, I'm afraid, but you can see obviously that each of the subject content statements are listed here. They are numbered, as well as the scope of study, which outlines the range of texts learners are expected to be able to read. The paper's marked out of 30 rather than 40, as is the case for our current level 1 reading assessments. So the new exams are generally a bit more focused and to the point. There will always be 20 questions at level 1, some of them multiple choice and some other types of fixed response, but there will also be a few that require more open answers. The next couple of slides will look at the content that is not new, but is now assessed more explicitly or in greater detail. If we take the first example, Subject Content Statement 10, or SCS 10, you'll get used to that acronym, is explicit about the need to compare information, ideas, opinions in different texts, not directly assessed within the current functional skills qualifications, but nevertheless has always been there as an expectation within the core curriculum. And as Catherine was saying a second ago, it was always there in the past as a requirement for key skills at level 1. Okay, so SCS 11, being able to separate fact versus opinion isn't really new, but again, it's now overtly part of what's being assessed at level 1. Same goes for having an awareness of language and other textual features can be varied to suit audiences and purposes. SCS 13 and SCS 14 are other examples of the sort of building blocks that were always part of the curriculum at level 1, but now find their way into the assessment criteria. Do bear in mind here that the reformed functional skills qualifications are more directly concerned with the testing of some of these underpinning skills. Okay, a few more SCSs. SCS 15 feels like another old friend making a reappearance. It's the requirement to infer meaning from images. Again, it's not new as far as the curriculum is concerned, nor was it not there in key skills, but again, it hasn't, certainly in the last few years, been tested directly within functional skills. The other 3 examples here, the SCS 16, SCS 17 and SCS 18 are further examples of some of these nuts and bolts that have always underpinned expectations at level 1, although previously were assessed implicitly rather than explicitly. So how might some of these new content be assessed in practice? These are examples from the first sample paper we produced for level 1. They're just one example of how these subject content statements might be addressed, so please don't assume that's the only way.
Moving on to level 2 now, again 30 marks and 2 source documents, but you'll see there are just 15 questions, so we're generally looking for slightly more developed responses than level 1. There are a few more subject content statements as well as a broader scope of study.
These are some examples of new, in inverted commas, content that hasn't necessarily featured in the adult literacy standards or curriculum before, at least not directly, although would of course fall within the scope of GCSE. If we take SCS 11, it's worth highlighting as it's being able to provide the right amount of detail is quite an important skill, and it's something that we'll now be overtly looking for within level 2 reading. Also, SCS 15 and SCS 19 are also a bit of a departure from what we've had in the recent past. Using reference materials was arguably always, I'll get my words out eventually, using the reference materials was arguably always there by implication, but now it's being looked for directly. Also, similarly, identifying different types of writing was perhaps touched upon within the content of assessing language features, but there's now much more of a slightly more, or a bit more of a GCSE style emphasis on what we might term writer's voice.
Bias, of course, is nothing new, but you can see here SCS 18 goes a little further in asking learners to identify levels of formality. We're arguably expecting them to be much better at critical reading than is the case for the current functional skills qualifications.
Again, these are examples, no more than that, of how these subject content statements might be assessed, but nevertheless, they give you a bit of a flavour. So let's now turn our attention to writing. Similar story as with reading in that there are subject content statements and a scope of study, and they are all, as is the case for all of the new Reformed Functional Skills qualifications, derived from the DFE subject content. At levels 1 and 2, learners are expected to write texts of varying complexity with accuracy, effectiveness, and correct spag. Notably, they're expected to understand how far they need to plan, draft, and adapt their language to purpose and audience. To an extent, that's always been the case, but it's now an explicit outcome. In terms of the nuts and bolts, both level 1 and level 2 will involve producing 2 documents, much as the case as at present. The only big difference is they'll no longer have access to dictionaries or spelling or grammar checkers. We've also upped the time allowance slightly to 90 minutes.
So, quite a busy slide here, but you can see the scope of study and subject content statements as they apply to level 1 writing. The first 3 subject content statements are concerned with SPAG, 12 marks available for each of the 2 writing tasks. The remaining 4 SCS are about composition, with 15 marks available for each. Each of the 2 documents is therefore worth up to 27 marks in total, so the paper as a whole is marked out of 54, as much as this actually offends my OCD. Although joking apart, the numbers here are quite carefully arrived at to ensure an appropriate balance between accuracy and content.
I wasn't going to say anything about your OCD, but you mentioned it.
We all know about my OCD.
Anyway, 3 of the subject content statements you can see on this slide could be described as new, or at least new as far as the explicitly being there as assessment expectations. First one's SCS 19. It did give me a little bit of a wry smile, because I suspect correct use of possessive apostrophes might be quite a big ask for quite a few level 1 learners. SCS 21 is meanwhile an unashamed nod towards that renewed focus on underpinning skills and the ability to spell common and specialist words correctly. SCS 25 is a bit less of a newer requirement, although it will make our examiner's job a bit easier to have use of complex sentences stated explicitly as requirements. And again, we have a few examples of how these statements could be assessed, and this obviously this example here is taken from the first sample we put together.
So SCS 20 is now explicit about consistent use of tenses, as well as a definite and indefinite articles. I do apologise, but I think we been on the road far too much, haven't we, Paul? I think we're ready for our break. This extract from the mark scheme from our sample paper illustrates how we'll award marks against this criterion. We're moving on to a branded approach, more like GCSE, where marks are awarded against these descriptors, rather than mechanically counting up the number of errors. Incidentally, this is one of the things of our new guidance for delivery document, once it's ready in September, will actually cover. And here's the spec for level 2. You'll see the mark weightings mirror those for level 1. Again, really not good for my OCD. And again, there are 3 SPAG criteria versus 4 concerned with composition.
So what's new at level 2? Well, if we take SCS 24 here, it arguably mirrors SCS 11 within reading. It's feeling like an episode of Line of Duty, isn't it?
Absolutely.
In looking for the right amount of detail with the situation. Meanwhile, SCS 25 and SCS 26 are both providing a bit more of a steer towards organising writing. One thing you definitely won't see in the new assessments are marks for plans or drafts at any level. All of this is really approached from the sort of a proof of the pudding. Can you actually produce something that makes sense standpoint? And here's some examples of more detail or more explicit criteria. SCS 20 sets out the scope of expected punctuation, colons, commas, inverted commas, apostrophes and quotation marks. Wow. SCS 27, meanwhile, outlines language and register expectations, and SCS 23 indicates the need to communicate coherently and effectively.
And here's an example of the sort of task that might probe that use of actual appropriate language and register.
Which finally takes our attention over to speaking, listening and communicating, as it is now known. Once again, the outcomes, scope and study, and subject content statements, I sound like a broken record here, come from the DFE document. At levels 1 and 2, learners are expected to be able to operate in a range of contexts, as well as adapting their own delivery to different audiences and purposes.
Okay, 8 subject content statements in total at level 1. Our speaking, listening, communicating assessment comprises of 3 activities, although each SES only needs to be evidence across the 3 activities rather than necessarily in each one. There are no marks here as SCL is a criterion based.
Okay, SCS 5 is expecting opinions and arguments to be backed up with evidence, something we've arguably not worried about too much before at level 1, but nevertheless part of that wider focus within the new qualifications on underpinning skills and being able to distinguish between fact, opinion, argument and assertion is kind of perhaps one way in which this is different. You can also see from the extract here, see an extract from one of our recording sheets for the discussion activity. This criterion could also potentially be addressed through the presentation or explanation.
Okay, these 5 subject content statements aren't wholly new, but are perhaps a little clearer in expectation. Again, we have an extract from the short talk record sheet to illustrate how we expect these to be evidenced. Some of these, most notably SCS2, illustrate why we've included a 3rd activity, where they are specifically expected to ask questions in response to a presentation. Some of the others, e.g. SCS7, illustrate the need to adapt contributions to audience, purpose and medium. Turn taking in SCS8 likewise isn't new, but using appropriate language for interjection hasn't been covered directly before.
And I'll just interject now and finally sort of give you the spec for level 2. Again, we're only expecting each of these to be covered across the 3 activities. You don't have to evidence them in all 3 activities. Note, the scope of study includes information that might be technical, concrete or abstract topics, although it's worth bearing in mind, especially given the changed rules on spiky profiles, that both level 1 and level 2 require a discussion, presentation and questioning session.
These 4 subject content statements might be regarded as new, although as with level 1, these aren't necessarily totally alien concepts. Again, SCS1 and SCS4 illustrate the need for the 3rd activity.
And again, 4 examples of not necessarily new stuff. SCS 6 is perhaps significant here, like its counterpart SCS 5 at level 1, in expecting persuasive evidence. SCS 5 at level 2 again touches on the idea of providing the right amount of detail as required by the situation. There's quite a lot of that if you look right through the new subject content for functional skills about providing enough information rather than too much. Which brings this deeper dive into English to a close. Just a few quick final points before we finish off this session.
If you haven't already had a look at our open assess, here's an overview. It's currently available for the legacy qualification sample assessment, although the sample exams for the new qualifications will also be available on open assess once the qualifications are live. We're having a break from this regular series of webinars next month, which by the sounds of listening to us,
feels like we need it, doesn't it?
I think we really do need it, especially me. But we will be back in September. We're also going to be running some special fun skills webinars over the summer, e.g. for exams officers to keep them to help them understand the changed invigilation requirements. So look out for these.
Which just leaves us to say thank you again for your attendance, and hopefully we'll see you at one of our events soon if we haven't already. Do continue to get in touch and follow the Fun Skills 3. Look out for the slides and the recording from this session. They'll be landing in your inbox within the next couple of days. Hope it hasn't been too bad listening to a recording rather than us being there in person. We will, after the session, take a look at the questions that or any questions that have been posed, and if we can obviously pick those up through the FAQs, we'll do that. But in the meantime, just have a good summer, and just bear in mind September isn't far away.